Today's talk will focus on the illumination of Qur'ans and other Islamic manuscripts, and we are delighted to have Dr. Annabel Teh Gallop, who's the lead curator for the Southeast Asia at the British Library.
So tonight I'm going to be talking on art and artists in Malay manuscript books. When I started working at the British Library in 1986, perhaps long before many of you were born, as curator for the Malay and Indonesian collections, I was especially enchanted by the beautiful ornamental frames sometimes found on opening pages. However, to me, there was a real art historical problem with all this beautiful material I had gathered. However long I studied and looked at manuscripts as beautiful as this, I couldn't discern any patterns or groupings or trends that seemed to make artistic sense. And it was only about 10 years later that the penny finally dropped. I had been looking in the wrong place with the wrong eyes. Courses in Malay literature and Malay manuscripts, such as those at SOAS and Leiden, are usually taught without constant cognition of the fact that the vast majority of manuscripts produced in the Malay world were Islamic texts, often written in Arabic or in Arabic and Malay. And in fact, the most beautiful examples of manuscript art in the Malay world are found not in literary texts such as these, but in religious texts. And at the pinnacle, of course, is the Qur'an. So in copies of the Qur'an in the Malay world, manuscript illumination reaches peaks not seen in literary manuscripts. And these examples of manuscript art are also found in considerable quantities. Over 600 illuminated Qur'an manuscripts from Southeast Asia have now been documented, let alone other religious works. And a study of this corpus very quickly yielded exactly the sorts of patterns and shapes that I had been hoping to find, but had not encountered earlier. Thus, distinctive schools of manuscript art can be identified in certain regional locations, for example, most prominently in Aceh. So this is a very typical example of a Qur'an manuscript from Aceh, an illuminated Qur'an manuscript. And the Achenese style of illumination can be defined very clearly in terms of the architecture of the decorated frames. The vertical borders always extend upwards and downwards beyond the limits of the rectangular frames around the text. And on the three outer sides of each page are always arches, while those on the vertical sides are flanked by a pair of tendrils or wings. Moving on to other religious manuscripts, we find that, albeit within highly stylized parameters, representational art can be found in certain genres of Malay manuscripts. In particular, Kitab Maulid, songs and verses in praise of the Prophet. These drawings normally comprise schematic depictions of Mecca and Medina, the holy cities, as in this particular manuscript from Terengganu. But who are the artists behind these books? In many Malay manuscripts, we find the scribe named. When we have the name of a scribe, can we assume that they also decorated the book? The short answer is no, we cannot assume that the scribe necessarily decorated the manuscript he copied, unless there is some other corroborative contextual evidence. In just one or two manuscripts, we do find tiny hints of who the artist might have been. For example, in this manuscript of Hikayat Carang Kulina from the Dewan Bahasa collection in Kuala Lumpur, and this is a well-known Panji story in Malay, we find a very small inscription at the tip of each of the 4 pillars of the decorated frames. In each case, all 4 cases, the inscription reads, Megat Anum Empunya. Megat Anum is the owner. But does this mean Megat Anum was the owner of the book? Or does it mean Megat Anum was the one responsible for the decoration? The latter possibility does seem very likely in this case due to the close integration of the name into the design, but we still cannot be categorical. Although it must be admitted that Singapore is a peripheral player in the world of Malay manuscripts, it moves to center stage in the era of printing, when it became the world center for Malay publishing in the second half of the 19th century. The key player in this story was Benjamin Peach Keysbury, a missionary who was crucially also an artist, who arrived in Singapore in 1839 and spent the rest of his life working on the island until his death in 1875. Keysbury was very well aware of the advantages of lithography for mimicking the Malay manuscript tradition. And under Keysbury's artistic eye, the Singapore Mission Press produced some of the most beautiful early Malay books ever printed. I started looking at these books again a few months ago. I was taken aback by just how many of the most attractive decorated books were works by Munshi Abdullah. For example, Hikayat Galila dan Damina, printed in around 1840, has attractive rectangular floral frames in rust red, which may indeed be the very first example of chromolithography or color lithography in Southeast Asia. In the Hikayat Abdullah, there is a famous episode when he describes how he earned money when he was small by decorating kites for little children. And he mentions how he learned to draw in Malacca as a young boy by watching the Chinese drawing pictures and patterns. So, in addition to Abdullah's many pioneering roles, he has been called Hadija has called him the father of modern Malay literature. When I first started working on printing, I called him the father of Malay printing. I think we could now also acknowledge him as the father of early Malay book decoration, and suggest that the art history of Singapore may actually have its origins in early Malay book decoration.
I was wondering whether some of the motifs would be linked to other art forms such as architecture, woodwork, carvings, and so on, if you've studied that as well?
I mean, that's an extremely interesting question and one I've long pondered. And again, I'm very, very, I tend to be very careful in making links. But I think probably of all the art forms, I mean, wood carving in some places tends to be one of the closest, affords the closest parallels. And for example, certainly in Acehese manuscripts, there's a very, very distinctive motif only found in Aceh of a plaited rope, and I've seen that on wood carving in Aceh as well. A good friend and colleague, Dr. Rosmawati from Malaysia, did suggest that maybe one reason for the perhaps the links between wood carving and manuscript illumination might have been that wood carvers also had to sketch their designs first. I think the interesting thing is that on the whole, in the Malay world, apart from perhaps with the sole exception of Terengganu, where the art form was raised to heights not achieved anywhere else in the Malay world, on the whole, it wasn't atelier or it wasn't specialized production. You don't get the feeling you're working with professional artists. Most of the manuscripts are produced in communities where the people who produced them would have been doing other things as well. So they would have drawn on other things that they might have done, but were never, they didn't earn their living from decorating manuscripts. There wasn't enough trade in that line of business to that. And so that's why you don't always see very clear patterns of influence with other art forms, I think.